pause and we'll go live in 3, 2, 1. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's McKaylee. I work at Tattered Bookstore. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for shopping locally. Thank you for supporting local independent bookstores. It means more to us than you will ever know. You are the reason that we have gotten through the past year, the past 50 years, because that's right, it is Tattered Cover's 50th anniversary here in 2021. And we owe a large part of that success to you, our community, whether you be virtual, joining us online for the past 18 months, or in person as we're slowly but surely building that back up. I also want to give a quick caveat. There are thunderstorms like crazy going on outside in where I live in Inglewood right now. So if you hear rumbling, it's not me or my stomach, it's the thunder. I apologize in advance. But just so you all know, that's what's going on. Back to my housekeeping real quick here. Before I go any further, I want to let you know that closed captioning is enabled for those who might want it or need it. There's a black bar at the bottom of the screen with a button labeled CC on it. You click that button, closed captioning is enabled should you want it or need it. And a little bit about Tattered Cover, for those of you who might not know. We are a local independent bookstore located in Denver, Colorado, and we currently have 5 locations, which is an amazing feat for a bookstore. We just opened, as of yesterday, our brand new children's location. It's so exciting. It's at Stanley Marketplace for anyone who knows the area, and you should definitely go check that out. Or our brand new building at McGregor Square, which is across the street from Coors Field. Check out those. And our Westminster store, hopefully, COVID and construction depending, will be opening sometime later this year as well. But you can get updates by that by signing up for our email newsletter or following us on social media or checking out our website. Also on our website is upcoming events. And oh my gosh, do we have so many of them. There's an incredible amount that you can join us. And you can watch our old virtual events on our YouTube channel, which is what you're watching us on right now. But the event that we have tonight, I'm very excited to have this conversation. I'm very excited to talk more about this book because I feel like a horrible history student that I never knew about the subject of this biography, but I assume I am not alone here. And the book that we're talking about tonight is The Great Dissenter by Peter S. Canellos. And I'm very excited, like I said, to talk more about this and just learn something that I never ever knew before. And it's the story of John Marshall Harlan, America's judicial hero. And a little bit about Peter, our author tonight. Peter S. Canellos is an award-winning writer and former editorial page editor of the Boston Globe and executive editor of Politico. He is the editor of the New York Times bestseller Last Lion, The Fall and Rise of Ted Kennedy. And like I said, we're talking about his new book, The Great Dissenter, and it's my pleasure to welcome Peter to the screen here. I'm going to turn it over so we all can see him. Hello, Peter, how are you?
Hello, McKaylee. Thank you for that enthusiastic introduction. I feel really special to be here, especially I didn't even realize it was your 50th anniversary. So I hope you have a great celebration. And as I told you earlier, I've heard wonderful things about Tattered Cover. So I really am excited to be here.
Absolutely. We're so happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. I would love to get started by you just giving us, it's hard to give a summary of this because you wrote a whole book about it, right? It's hard to condense all of that information into a little bit, like 2-minute bit, but could you give us just an insight as to what this book is about? Maybe an overview of who John Marshall Harlan is?
Yeah, I mean, the overview, the short answer is it's about how a person's life experiences can affect their decisions as a Supreme Court justice. It's also about how you can make law through dissent, which is an important message for a lot of people right now. And it's mostly just a very deep and involving kind of tale involving a person who's a very underappreciated, though still much honored Supreme Court justice and an important figure in his own right, but also the man who was presumed to be his half-Black brother, who had a significant effect on his life and who became a major civil rights leader, African-American civil rights leader in the years after the Civil War. So it's about this relationship between two men, one Black, one white, rumored to have the same father, who grew up alongside each other, but developed a relationship that was not what you would expect of somebody who's enslaved and somebody who was part of the, other side of the family, so to speak. They developed real mutual respect, collaboration, friendship over the years. The basic story of John Marshall Harlan is of a man who grew up in a slave-owning family, had some of the privileges of being in an upper-class Kentucky family, but then after the Civil War, dramatically changed course. And when the rest of the white community were starting, he joined the Supreme Court in 1877. When the rest of the white world turned against African Americans, refused to enforce African American rights, he became a very emphatic, loud dissenter, decrying the wrong done to African American people, and became a very great hero to African Americans. We know that now because African American newspapers had not been digitized until recently. You can see how Harlan's dissents in cases that took away civil rights, voting rights, the right to education alongside whites, and that approved the legal architecture of segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson, how those words mattered to African Americans and how they inspired the leaders of the 20th century civil rights movement. Parallel to that, Harlan was called the Great Dissenter, not just because he dissented in race cases, he also dissented in cases that took away economic freedoms from average Americans during the Gilded Age. The best way to understand Harlan and what it meant to be a dissenter in his era is that during his time on the court, which was 1877 to 1911, we now know there were two big things that happened in society. One was the approval of segregation, the laying the groundwork for what was essentially 100 years of oppression that still affects society today. The other thing was the continuation of income inequality during the Gilded Age. You know, we all, at least those of us in the East, can go to these sort of Versailles-like palaces built by the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. And yet we also know that our own immigrant grandparents were living, 5 and 6 to a room in some cases because they couldn't be paid enough in their factory jobs to live independently. And you wonder, how did that inequality continue? And the answer is that the Supreme Court ruled against. Initially, they declared the Sherman Antitrust Act unconstitutional. They declared the income tax unconstitutional, and they declared all labor regulations unconstitutional. Harlan dissented in all of those cases as well. So here's a man whose record of dissent has been vindicated through time. His views are now the views of the law. So the thinking behind this book is let's go back and say, well, how did he see things differently than everyone else? And why was he right when everyone else was wrong? That's the theme of the book.
And I'm curious to know, how did Harlan enter your life? How did you first hear about him? Or was it Robert who first entered your life?
He did enter my life. I'm a law school graduate. I went to Columbia Law School, and while I was a student there, studied civil rights. And law is not taught through dissent. Law is taught that one case leads after another, and the law doesn't become the law until the majority of the Supreme Court says it's the law. And yet, because some of Harlan's dissents in race cases were so prominent, they did pop up, and they actually kind of really popped up from the page, because here was somebody who was not seeing things in sort of dry legal terms. He was invoking much larger themes of justice, and in many cases invoking methods of interpreting the law that are relevant today. I mean, when he stood up for equal protection, he was standing up for the plain language of the U.S. Constitution in the amendments that were passed after the Civil War. He was also supporting the original intent of the amendments after the Civil War. He was defending essentially the verdict of the Civil War that everybody understood was the verdict of the Civil War, but that in his time in the court in the 1880s and 1890s, there was a sort of unwritten understanding within the country that the price of reconciliation with the South was throwing African Americans under the bus. And he was really the only major white figure who was not doing that. It's an astonishing record.
And so I'm curious about Robert and John's relationship. That's something that in this book was the most prominent, and you brought it up in your summary too, of this idea that of one supporting the other and John changing what his views were with how he was raised and how he grew into being a defender and a hero to the Black community. But Robert himself was this Black businessman and hugely successful as a free man. And can you talk about a little bit more about their relationship and what was so fascinating to you about that?
I think it's fascinating that they maintained a respectful relationship through their lives, given all of the unusual circumstances, not just one of them being technically enslaved, though he grew up with a lot of privileges. It was also the sort of rumors that were so apparent, they were in newspapers of that era, that they shared a father. Now, subsequently, 5 generations later, there was a DNA test that suggested that may not have been the case, but it was widely believed at the time that Robert was the son of James Harlan, who was John Marshall Harlan's father. Nonetheless, they did get along. They shared a political perspective in the, once you got past the Civil War, they really agreed on everything. But Robert Harlan also became essential in some ways to John Marshall Harlan's career, because after the Civil War, well, let's start a little earlier. He had spent the years before the Civil War fighting to prevent it. His entire young adulthood and childhood really were dedicated to preventing civil war, and grew up under the shadow and the fear of war. People in Kentucky believed that they would be the battleground in the war. They also knew that because they were half slave and half free, that it would destroy the sort of cultural fabric of their state. That's why leading Kentuckians like Henry Clay were considered the great compromisers, pushing through the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 and others that tried to put slavery on a path to eventual liberation through things like colonization or compensation of slave owners, or other, making it easier for slave owners to emancipate their own slaves on their death, but still preserving the economic interests of the South. Now, these compromises to today's eyes are not the most honorable thing. I think it's very easy for people today to say, you can't compromise when you're talking about something like slavery. But the reality was that in Kentucky, there was very little actual abolition movement. There was, in fact, people who were defensive of slavery and siding with the South. And then there were people like the Harlans who believed in the North and the national destiny and were willing to sacrifice slavery, but tended to favor a long-term kind of path to emancipation rather than a war and an immediate emancipation. That obviously, after the Civil War, it may have played a role. It did play a role in keeping Kentucky neutral and then part of the Union, which I think actually helped the cause of abolition far more than if somebody had taken a principled stand and sort of driven Kentucky into the South, into the arms of the South. Nonetheless, after the war, that didn't look too good to the Republican Party. So here's John Marshall Harlan becoming part of the Republican Party. He was suspected of somebody who probably harbored some pro-slavery feelings, who did not really buy into the Republican platform, which at that time was very supportive of African Americans. However, you had Robert Harlan, who was the leading Black politician in Ohio, which was the most important state at that time because it was the swing state in presidential elections, and the African American vote was what swung the state to the Republicans. So Robert Harlan, in perceiving to be in control of the African American vote, he was on a first name basis with Ulysses S. Grant and with Rutherford Hayes and with many leaders of the Republican Party. So the fact that he was willing to vouch for this man in Kentucky who grew up in the home in which he had been enslaved is a very, very important credential. It's very likely John Marshall Harlan would never have made the Supreme Court if it weren't for that. Now, the circumstances of John Marshall Harlan going on the Supreme Court were themselves kind of interesting, in that in 1876, there was a disputed presidential election between Hayes and Samuel Tilden, something we're sadly familiar with in recent years. But this was a particularly serious one. 3 states sent competing electors to Washington. It was a total mess. Behind the scenes, an unwritten deal was cut where troops were going to be removed from the South to allow former Confederates to return to positions of power in exchange for the Republicans in Rutherford B. Hayes becoming president. And one of the promises that Hayes made, somewhat informally, was to put a Southerner on the court. They were all Northerners on the Supreme Court. But he had a problem, and that is that the Republicans still controlled the Senate, and the Northern Republicans tended to be of the radical variety that defended Black rights. So the man who controlled the Judiciary Committee, George Edmunds of Vermont, was a strong civil rights advocate. So he had to pick a Southerner who was also a strong civil rights advocate. Kentucky was as close, it's sort of a border state, but as close to the South as you could get. John Marshall Harlan was admired for his intelligence, for his legal acumen, for his experience. He had been the Attorney General of Kentucky. And with the sort of vouching of people like Robert Harlan, but also some other Republican leaders, he just skated by confirmation and got onto the Supreme Court, which means, ironically, all of those Northerners who were doubting him, they themselves turned their backs on the Black community. He did not. That's part of the irony here.
I'm so interested in not just the history of, like, sorry, it's so fascinating to me to hear you talk about like the backdoor deals and how he actually got on the court and like just the domino effect of it all. And I'm curious about why we haven't learned about this man. In your opinion, I think about like my education, and I know some court cases. I took AP government, like I know, but at the same time, I could not tell you who this is. So why do you think he's been written out of American education? Because of his dissenting nature or some other reason?
Yeah, I think dissent plays a large part of it. One thing that I found out in my research is that these dissents, that even the ones that today are famous, his dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson, among many people who are lawyers or lawyers, they know that he dissented in Plessy v. Ferguson, and his dissent has some very memorable phrases. The Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. There is no caste here. These are memorable lines from his dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson. But from the time that he died in 1911 until Brown versus Board of Education ended segregation, the legally, didn't really end it, but ended the legal support for segregation in 1954, there were entire histories of John Marshall Harlan's time on the Supreme Court that were written that never mentioned any of the Black cases. It was that much of a sort of unspoken topic within the white community. What we know now is that in the Black community, he was an unmitigated hero. He was a person whom anybody who cared about the law knew him as the great defender of African American rights. When he died in 1911, there were memorial services in cities that he had never even visited, where Black churches would get together to mourn his passing. In Washington, there were 3 of those services, and then there was a collective memorial service at Metropolitan AME, which was the largest church in Washington, where they read aloud from his dissents. So generations of Black lawyers and people concerned about the status of African Americans knew Harlan. He was the connecting thread. He was the person who gave them hope that there would be someone somewhere that could persuade the white community to see things through their eyes. Nonetheless, during segregation, the white world paid no attention to what was going on in the Black world. So Harlan was well known in the Black community, totally unknown in the white community. After Brown versus Board of Education, there was more respectful attention was given to him. But keep in mind that law schools don't teach dissent. That approach, the case study method, sort of teaches you that the law evolves over time from majority opinion to majority opinion to majority opinion. Even if there were other people who were saying other things and who are laying the groundwork for some of these decisions, it's not included in the law school version of what happened. At the same time, history classes tend to leave the evolution of the law to law schools a little bit. So I think those are some reasons why Harlan didn't get credit. I also think that there's just a tendency in society generally to undervalue dissenters. In our own time, those of us who are a little older, at least, can remember the people who opposed the Iraq War and who are 100% proven right. And you rarely hear today anyone say, oh, Jacques Chirac, who was president of France, really got it right. He understood exactly what was wrong here. No, people don't say that. It was the arms inspector, Scott Ritter, who claimed that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and was proven right. Still, no one really credits him. Arundhati Roy, she was right, but people still think she's, a leftist voice in the wilderness. I think that there's something about society that is unwilling to, or just doesn't like talking about the person who was right when everybody else, including everybody like them, was wrong. And that's a hard thing to swallow sometimes.
Absolutely. It reminds me very much of that cliche phrase about that, like, history's written by the winners, in a sense of, they might have been right. John Harlan might have been right at the time, and while they won the war, was a certain legality to it, that winners of the legal system, they hadn't put laws into place yet. And so they won on their side, and it wasn't until it flipped did it get rewritten and rediscovered. And I'm curious about, as we're on this topic of dissent, and if you don't mind, we have a question of, can you just explain very quickly what dissent means in a legal sense, and why you chose this particular title? Because I know what it means, but I realize that there might be people watching who may not be familiar with that term.
No, absolutely. What it means is the Supreme Court has 9 members, and they had a process of sort of rules evolving over time. When the Supreme Court first began, every justice would write their own opinion of the case, and lawyers were left to sort of cobble together, what evolved fairly quickly under the leadership of Chief Justice John Marshall, the person for whom John Marshall Harlan was named, was the idea that the court would deliver a more forceful majority opinion, that when you had 5 or more justices on one side, there would be a majority opinion that would state the law. Now, dissents were sort of discouraged because there was a feeling among some justices that the credibility of the court was undermined if there was a lot of dissent going on. But nonetheless, it persisted. And so dissent means that a justice who is not in the majority writes why he thinks the majority is wrong. And that becomes part of the official record. And until Harlan came along, there was really no other justice who made their entire career in dissent. There were some important and memorable dissents. For example, the Dred Scott decision was a terrible case that helped to bring about the Civil War, in which the Supreme Court went out of its way to say all Black people, free or slave, were never included in the Constitution, and they would never have any rights that white people were bound to respect. It was a terrible decision, and John Harlan, who was then in his 20s, recognized that as soon as that decision came down, there would be no more compromises, that war was coming, his state was going to be destroyed. So he lived the rest of his life, under the shadow, in some sense, of the Dred Scott decision. 2 justices dissented from that decision, and one of them wrote a long dissent. Benjamin Curtis was his name. But he was so upset about the decision that he quit in protest and left the court. That was the status of dissent before Harlan. Harlan was the first to dissent forcefully against his colleagues and to stay for another 25 years, dissenting again and again and again. Hence his title as the Great Dissenter. Today, dissent is a very frequently used tool on the Supreme Court. We may be entering another era very similar to Harlan's, where the Supreme Court is more conservative than the country. And you will see the liberal justices, the more liberal justices, Kagan, Stephen Breyer, Sotomayor, resorting more often to dissent. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg made a strong reputation in dissent in recent years, and she frequently cited John Marshall Harlan as her role model of what she hoped would happen with her dissent.
That's how I know what dissent is because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, actually, which is amazing. So in a very interesting way, he started this trend of making sure that both sides are heard, in a sense of giving people, and not only, utilizing the platform of like why I disagree with this, But
not only did he dissent as a matter of principle, and I think people can admire him for that, but in the case of the civil rights cases particularly, but also some of the economic cases, his dissents contained the seeds of overturning the majority opinion. We talked about how the Black community so honored John Marshall Harlan, read his dissents aloud, studied them, Black lawyers studied them. By the time the 1930s and 40s rolled around, and Thurgood Marshall and other great Black civil rights leaders, James Nabret and others, were going around the South looking for plaintiffs who are willing to sue to challenge the separate but equal doctrine, to challenge segregation. These plaintiffs knew they were putting their lives on the line. They knew that the Ku Klux Klan was paying attention. Harlan's dissents in the cases involving African-American rights, but especially Plessy v. Ferguson, which Thurgood Marshall called his Bible, he would invoke it, he would mention it as evidence that this risk that they were taking would not be for naught, that eventually the Supreme Court would see things through their eyes. And in their legal briefs, in case after case, as they were building the case against segregation, and then finally in their legal brief to the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, they quoted Harlan's dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson, right there in the center. So in a very real way, Harlan's dissent became the majority opinion over time.
I want to ask you about, because in this conversation we call him Harlan, and in the book you often call him John and Robert. And is there a distinction there about, and it was mentioned, I think, in a New York Times review or something about that switch in names. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why you did it?
It's interesting. I mean, a lot of people have noticed that, and some people sort of feel like it violates things. I think part of it is that when people look at the cover of the book, I used to have a copy of the book here, but I don't have it with me. But when people look at the cover of the book, they see a sort of stately portrait of a Supreme Court justice, and they may have some assumptions that this story is in the mold of the stately, respectful story about the law, that if you don't understand everything about the law, you're not going to really get this book. In fact, as you're suggesting, it's kind of a rollicking read. It's a real yarn. It's a family story. It's an adventure story in a lot of ways. And hence, the lead characters, John and Robert Harlan, should be known as John and Robert rather than Justice Harlan, Mr. Harlan, or Harlan 1, Harlan 2. It's a way of giving readers a chance to sort of see them as real people and to see things through their eyes. The way that the book is constructed, in the first half of the book, or first part of the book, after you get through the introduction and the prologue, it tells 200 pages of their family history, which of course includes the Civil War. In Robert Harlan's part, this man of mixed race, denied a chance at education, who goes to the gold rush to raise a fortune. He's going through the jungles of Panama to get there. He's coming back. He's facing white vigilantes in Lexington, chasing him out of the town. He goes to Cincinnati, which is the terminus of the Underground Railroad. He invests in Black-owned businesses, including a hotel that hides runaways in the back of the building. Slave catchers are trying to catch people. Robert Harlan then also goes to England. He takes a group of American horses to England to race against British racers, try to set up like a transatlantic battle of horse racing. Meanwhile, John Harlan is fighting to keep Kentucky neutral. He's standing on the street corners of Louisville with a bullhorn in his mouth, trying to prevent the Confederate governor from allowing Kentucky to join the Confederacy. He succeeds, and then pulls together his own regiment of more than 1,000 people to fight on the Union side. And he lives the life of a Civil War soldier, seeing death up close for the better part of 2 or 3 years, talking about stepping over bodies at Shiloh and things like that. So you see all these experiences, the horrors of slavery, the racism that even the most successful African Americans faced, the plucky fights that kept people free in Cincinnati, the ways that African Americans had to find their opportunity in places like the Gold Rush in England, and the battles that went on in the border states to try to prevent them from joining the Confederacy. You see all of that, and then in the second half of the book, you see these characters that you now know, and their values and their stories, confronting some of the biggest issues of that time, but really of all time in American history, because the Constitution changed after the Civil War. The cases that John Marshall Harlan was hearing in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and in the first decade of the 20th century, were the first shot the court had at interpreting these new post-Civil War amendments. And it was only John Harlan who said that what they mean is greater freedom for all Americans, but also particular protections for African Americans against what everybody knew would be an attempt by the South to re-enslave people. So it's a fascinating story that looks at how one's life experiences can determine what one's contribution is in such a public role as being on the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. And I have one more question before we turn it over to our audience Q&A. So for those of you watching right now, there's a chat next to the screen you're watching us on, and you can type in your questions there. But I want to ask you, Peter, about why this book right now? Why does John Marshall Harlan need to be reintroduced to us right now?
I think there are two reasons. One is people are very interested in dissent. People like you talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and all of that. This is an illustration of how dissent can work. We talked a little about the race cases and Thurgood Marshall and putting Harlan's dissent in the middle of their legal briefs to overturn segregation in Brown versus Board of Education. But the economic cases were also very, very interesting. So in one particularly terrible case, the Supreme Court, which at that time was again made up of Northern conservative justices, very pro-business. This was the Gilded Age. This was the time of income inequality. This was the time when workers were rebelling. A lot of people felt that supporting the leaders, the business leaders of the country, you were supporting the capitalist economic system that made America great. When the income tax came through, it was intended to replace a system of tariffs that had been used, tariffs on basic goods, to fund the government. The feeling by Congress was that funding the government through tariffs was unfair because poor people and rich people were burdened equally by tariffs. If you put a tariff on sugar, the person eating sugar who has no money pays the same amount of a burden as the rich person eating sugar. So there were various times in American history when there had already been income taxes, including to fund the Civil War. And this was only 20 or 30 years after the Civil War. So the income tax is passed. Right away, the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers realized this, they're coming after them, and there was a tremendous fear of this. There was a fear that went beyond just a small handful of wealthy people, that this was a tool that would be used by the downtrodden masses to repeatedly take income from people who, in some cases, deserved it because they were taking the risk and creating businesses and doing things like that. The Supreme Court was very conservative, Northerners, pro-business Northerners. They found a very flimsy pretext to declare the income tax unconstitutional. I'm not going to immediately get into it, but they overturned 100 years of precedent to declare it unconstitutional. Harlan issued one of his strongest, most forceful dissents. And in this case, unlike in the race cases, everyone in the white community was paying attention. This was a national event where people knew of Harlan's dissent. A young congressman from Tennessee who shared some of Harlan's values read that dissent and used it as a basis to, over time, make the case to pass a constitutional amendment to overturn that Supreme Court decision. His name was Cordell Hull. And by 1913, which was 18 years after this terrible case, this Pollock case, a constitutional amendment passed that allowed the income tax. And since 1913, we've had taxation on the rich, for better or for worse. Now, that 18-year period was terrible because the political will existed back in the early 90s to deal with income inequality. But for 20 years, you had a situation where the poor and the rich were sort of equally burdened by things. You even had a worse situation, as Harlan warned in his dissent, that if you ever were in a world war, there would be no trade, so there would be no tariffs, so the federal government would be left with no money to fight the war. Fortunately, the constitutional amendment was passed in 1913, just before World War I came in. So Harlan's dissent, which was, read multiple times in Congress, read into the congressional record, taken to the public as an example of why the Supreme Court was wrong, why a constitutional amendment needed to be passed. That's a resurrection moment as well, and an important sort of lesson for today's dissenters about what can happen when you dissent. The one other reason I think it's relevant today is that today's Supreme Court justices generally don't have the life experiences that some of their predecessors did. Now, it's not reasonable to say, well, let's fight another civil war so everyone gets more life experience, but there is a tendency today to have people earmarked from the time they're in law school as top students. They get the top clerkships, they could get academic jobs, and they're appointed to lower court positions. And then by the time they're 40 years old, they're considered ready to go in the Supreme Court. I think that in that situation, everything is an academic debate. In some ways, they're more stubborn about things because they've come along, persuaded that this is the way you interpret the Constitution. They aren't thinking human beings in quite the same way that people who lived through tumultuous times know that you have to adapt and you have to think creatively and you have to worry about what these cases mean to people on the ground. I think that's a big lesson of Harlan's life, and it's something that's missing from most of the justices, not all the justices, but most of the justices on the current court.
This is so interesting to me. And again, like I said, it's something that I'm new to, but that I think affects our world in ways that we never know. And I was having a conversation we have a series, Leaders as Readers, who are readers, not necessarily authors, but talk about books that influence them. And we were having a conversation about how it just opens up our mind to so many things. And I think that people will find this book readable in ways that some other biographies may not be, in some ways that other law books or history books might not be. And so that you should definitely get your copy of The Great Dissenter by Peter here at tatteredcover.com. I do want to turn it over to our audience for a little bit of Q&A in the last several minutes that we have here, which is a really great question about research. And how did you conduct research and figure out what to put in the book and what to leave out? Because obviously you're a wealth of knowledge, but you had to put it all in one book. How did that process work?
Well, it's also difficult when you talk about somebody who spent 34 years on the Supreme Court, and there are thousands of cases. I chose to really focus on the most important cases, the cases that I think really defined his legacy. I also tried to address the rather small number of cases where some people have criticized his opinions so that people can get a fully rounded kind of position on Harlan's jurisprudence. But I did not try to make it the kind of biography where, every step of the way is recorded, and then in the following month, there was such a meeting or conference that he attended. We had a lot of that information, but I didn't feel like it was the thing to focus on in this book. I wanted this to be a story about how the law is created and the values that go into it and how those values are shaped. Not a story that captured, every minute of the day of somebody's life. So having that sense of what the story was that I wanted to say and what to tell and what was essential to that story and what wasn't helped to cull the amount of research. I think some people will look at this book and say, wow, you continued covering Robert Harlan long past the time that he played a role in helping John get on the court. That was done because I think it's very important for people to understand the personal cost of some of these decisions on the Supreme Court. So as you see the Supreme Court pulling back support for the African-American community in the cases in which John Harlan is dissenting, you see very visibly how it affects Robert Harlan and his descendants and how they go from this position of wealth and power and importance in the Black community, where they maintain their importance in the Black community and they maintain their level of education, but slowly sort of money and any source of interaction between the Black community and the white community are drained away during segregation. So the family story, the human story sort of continues through John Marshall Harlan's time on the court, but you can see exactly how these Supreme Court decisions affect American lives.
No, that's one of the things that I think adds a level to this biography in a way that others don't, of seeing that other side of the coin, and that the fact that you did continue Robert's story throughout. Do you hope maybe that someone picks up Robert's story, or were there books that if we are not more interested, but if we are interested in learning more about his legacy, that we can reference?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, right now, more is known about him than has ever been known before, but there is not a separate biography of Robert Harlan. But he lived a fascinating life, and he helped to shape the African-American political agenda in the 19th century. He also was part of very important debates about the future of the African-American community, debates in which both sides had lots of good points. He was part of what was essentially like a Lincoln-Douglas style debate with somebody who was actually a friend of his, but took a very different view about whether Blacks should be supporting the Republican Party, and felt, something like a Black nationalist viewpoint, that Blacks should defend their own interests and sort of bargain with both parties, but not side with one party or another, which is a very relevant discussion within the African-American community today. So there's a lot to learn from Robert Harlan's life, and I certainly do hope that somebody steps forward and keeps researching his life.
Absolutely. Sometimes I hate asking authors these questions, but when it pops up, what is next for you? And I say that with the caveat of, A, I know you might not be able to tell us, B, it's totally okay if it's nothing because you just produced this amazing book, but do you have another project in the works that you can hint at?
I do not have a particular book project in the works. I have several ideas. I also am still working at Politico. I'm managing editor of Politico, so I have a day job that's somewhat consuming. So I have to balance my outside research with what I'm doing in my regular job. And the Harlan story was very much a singular story. As I say, it dates back to when I was in law school 30 years ago. And it's been a facet of my life. It's been an interest of mine for a very long time. So I'd like to find something that either captivates me in the same way that the Harlan story captivates me, or something that is sort of completely different. Maybe doing a shorter narrative kind of book that would be more contemporary. So those are the things that are on my mind a little bit, Michaela.
No, and that's great. Like I said, some people don't always understand. It's like, I just gave you this book. You want the next one already? So.
I think here's something I think there's a good book in the income tax Gilded Age stuff that I was describing before, because there's an amazing backstory to that income tax decision. And it also sort of goes to a very relevant question today, which is the role of taxation in promoting a fairer and more just society. And that's an interest of mine, but I'm not necessarily committed to doing it right now, but it's something that definitely has sparked my curiosity.
And if anybody wants to know more about it, there's a great historical fiction novel called A Well-Behaved Woman about the Vanderbilts, and that comes into play into it, in case anybody cares. That's how I know about it.
Excellent. I didn't even know about that book, so that's great to know.
There you go. Therese Ann Fowler is the author's name. But so the last question that I have here for you, Peter, is one that we love to ask here at Tattered Cover to end our series and end our events. So interpret it as you will. But what did this book, The Great Dissenter, teach you?
Oh, well, what it taught me is the centrality of the Supreme Court in American life. Like a lot of people, I sort of had the view that the court kind of followed American values, that, the best way to sort of change the court is to change the perceptions of things on the ground. And I actually came away with a different view. I think that if the Supreme Court had taken Harlan's position on those race cases, and I think they could have, it would not miraculously have ended discrimination. It would not have prevented Southern states from trying to create some form of segregation. It would not have prevented them from trying to take away voting rights. But I do think it would be meaningful to some officials that, the voting rights case involved Alabama's constitution, which essentially disenfranchised Black people. If the court had forced Black people to be registered in Alabama, there would have been some local officials there'd be a lot of shenanigans as they tried to defy the court. But there would also be a lot of people who would not defy the court, who would still have respect for the court. And that opens the door to progress. So the the journey that America has been on since 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, that journey would have started in 1895, 96 with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision if it had been decided another way. At the same time, in the Gilded Age cases, I was surprised to learn that the political will existed in the 1890s to take on these major trusts that were sort of dictating wages to workers and dictating prices to consumers. But the Supreme Court declared the Sherman Antitrust Act unconstitutional and then declared the income tax and then struck down labor laws. That all changed in the next like 15 to 30, 40 years, but that's a long period of time. If the court had decided those decisions the other way, we would have had a more equal society much earlier. So it taught me that, when you look back in that era, the presidents during that era, Grover Cleveland, McKinley, Benjamin Harrison, Garfield, Chester Arthur, did they shape things or did the Supreme Court shape things? I think you can make the case the Supreme Court shaped things more than they did.
Peter, I want to say thank you. This has been such an insightful conversation. I've been hanging on your every word. It's so fascinating. Thank you for also making it accessible to people in this book, and thank you in the conversation as well. I know that I'm not the only one who appreciated it. I want to remind everyone that you can get the copy of The Great Dissenter, excuse me, at tatteredcover.com. You should definitely get your copy today or at any one of our locations if you are here in the area. Peter, I want to give you a chance to remind people who you are, where they can find you online, and anything else that you want to say.
Well,
before...
you can find me on Twitter at petercanellos.com. You can also, or at Peter Canellos, and I also have a peterscanellos.com personal website. But right now, the best way to get to know me is to get to know the book. So you can find copies of the book at tatteredcover.com, and please do support independent bookstores like Tattered Cover, which make it possible to have these kinds of really exciting events. So thank you so much, Michaela.
Peter. That means a lot. And so I just reiterate and say ditto to what he has said about shopping locally. Thank you all so much for your continued support this year and the past 50 years. It means so much to us. If you missed any part of this interview, you can just use the same link and watch it on our YouTube channel. Share it with your friends as well. Peter, if you'll hang around while I close this out here. This has been talking about the new book, The Great Dissenter by Peter Canellos. We thank you all so much for joining us. Stay safe, everybody, and happy reading. Good night, all. And we're out.